opening the general meeting. We have an agenda which you can get a copy of, which of course we're already off schedule, but we'll catch up pretty quickly here. I'm going to start off with a little introduction to Chestnut for people who haven't been doing this for 30 some odd years, and don't be insulted by any of the titles I'm about to put up here. I've had various names for this. I had various. Come on.
I have an advance for me.
I can just. I'll do it this way. Yeah, it was working a little while ago. Sure. Yeah. That's why I like that back. Because sometimes. Anyway, we've had various names for this this lecture. One of the started off being kind of collegial. We called it Chestnut 101, as if you were. I've got a new device. That's okay.
Brian, this works pretty well and has a pointer as well.
All right, we'll try another one. Back to try another one.
Technology strikes again.
Yeah, it works. Oh, it works anyway. Okay.
And the pointer is on top. Right?
Yeah, okay, the pointer's on. Thank you. We call it Chestnut 101. We try to be all collegial. And then we have other names for it. And we also have called this Chestnut for Dummies. Don't be insulted. For those nice books, you've ever seen one of those for Dummies guides. We've used that. And then also, I was thinking of an old Woody Allen movie. Everything you want to know about American Chestnut, but we're afraid to ask. It's too long. And just now, I've kind of settled on a quick start guide to Chestnut, and especially Chestnut restoration. If you're the kind of person who gets a new toy and you put it out of the box, just use it right away. This is the quick start guide, so that's what we're going to do. And as you know, I got into chestnut myself by misidentifying a horse chestnut. So I thought I'd just share the story because you probably talk to people, and a lot of people when they're talking about chestnuts, they're really talking about horse chestnuts. So we don't make that mistake, but it's pretty easy to do. And that's how I got into it. And I realized I don't really know much about trees because I should learn something. This is back around 1990, and this is not a chestnut. You tried to cook it in the microwave, and it didn't taste very good. Anyway, there's a reason you can be easily confused, even if you're in the right species. There are a lot of trees that look kind of like a chestnut, and that's because they're all related. And I'm not going to do the test, but beech over here, sawtooth oak, chestnut oak, that fooled me a couple times, and then Siberian elm, I haven't seen too many of those. But then of course we have Chinese chestnut trees, American chestnut trees. Those are the ones we are going to talk about mostly today. And as I said, it makes sense. They're all members of the Fagaceae family, so it doesn't. There's a reason that you can be confused. All right. We're interested in the American chestnut, the great huge sequoia of the east. We're interested in that great tree that produced millions of tons of chestnuts for wildlife and produced lumber for people, all sorts of beautiful things that, of course, now all of a sudden seem to be totally absent from our landscape. So this is what we're interested in. And I want you to take yourself back in your mind to pre-European contact. Imagine the Appalachians, and imagine what the forest must have been like before Europeans came in and started clearing a lot of land. And of course you had wolves and mountain lions and passenger pigeons, 4 billion chestnut trees, and who knows, probably 5 million humans in all of the Americas. All of the Americas. So it was a different world. And of course, this is the range map that we usually see. And if you want to ignore all those state boundaries, because really, let's say they weren't there. I want to take you back further in Chestnut history, just to think about it for a second. By the way, the scientific name is Chestnut. And sorry, I'm a Latin teacher, so I pronounce it differently from most people. We know that probably there's all sorts of different ranges of percentage, but maybe 25% of the hardwood forest is chestnut, a large amount, whether it's doesn't really matter, millions of acres. But take yourself back to 18,000 to 20,000 years before present. We have to remember the chestnut was not where we are now, and there's this huge ice sheet over most of New England, lots of the Midwest, and the poor little chestnut species was hiding out way down here in a little refuge down here. It was tried because the climate was just too cold, but as the climate changed, it moved north, and within about 18,000 years or so, it kind of moved right up, and about 1000 AD, it probably had spread up to where we have the range map there today. And I cannot resist this. There's always a story about the squirrel who starts up on a chestnut in Maine and can make his way all the way down to Alabama or Mississippi without leaving chestnut. So obviously, it's an important species, huge species, very successful species. I just wanted to go through the life cycle of the chestnut a little bit, and this is actually not what I really wanted to show you, but I'll show it to you anyway. It seems to be there. I'm going to go through these steps more quickly, less quickly later on, but there's a lot that has to happen for this little nut to actually grow up to be that tree and make more nuts, and that's what we try to get involved in the science. So here we go. Let's start off with the nut, right? Pretend we don't even know, there's a nut on the ground. And the great thing is it's tasty, right? We've all had chestnuts. That's really important because the tree only can survive because the nut is tasty, because it relies on wildlife to take it, want to eat it, and spread it around and hopefully lose it, right? Hopefully somehow not get back to it. So that is really important. Of course, the genes of the two parents are in that nut, so that's also really important. And this usually in our area happens around October. So the nut's just lying there on the ground. We'll get rid of all the other things that could happen to it. Now, if you go on, there's the nuts lying on the ground. Then, there's this other step that has to take place called stratification. The nut has to kind of go to sleep, and it has to feel a certain temperature for a certain amount of time. And of course, that happens from November through March. And the chestnut has a kind of a weird little antifreeze system in it. The sugars keep it from going too, in general, like getting too cold, or it can basically survive fairly cold temperatures, and it keeps the nut a little warmer than freezing, even though it's below freezing. So that is a pretty good system that the nut has. And then, amazingly, as you know, in April, or depending on the conditions, all of a sudden the nut knows to start to grow, and it shoots out its little radicle. And then if you're lucky, then right out here, you get the little tree starts coming out, and that usually happens around April here.
Brad, just
Yeah.
one thing.
Yeah.
Just remember that the roots first to come out, so if you plant them, the root goes down.
Exactly,
We had a
yeah.
girl that bet if you planted them all up. and-
Oh, no.
Okay, so.
It's whenever we always put the root down, and there are other things you can do. You can like clip off the root, and it doesn't hurt if you clip it off a little bit and then plant it. But yes, you do plant it, and it will naturally eventually start heading down, no matter where it is. And then hopefully, let's pretend no predators, nothing else is happening. You start getting a little seedling comes up on the soil forest floor, and that's obviously May through June. And the problem is you have to watch out because the nut stays attached to the seedling for a while, and of course the nut is a good target for lots of animals. So a lot of times, a lot of rodents will rip up the seedling because they're trying to get at the nut. So that's another danger time. And then really all the seedling is doing is trying to get up to the sun, right? It's trying to get up to the light. That's its job for the next 2,600 years, right? Get up to the light. And then you get sort of the sapling stage where the chestnut is actually beyond seedling. It's a little tree. This is actually one of the woods around here. It's starting to head up towards the light. And depending on how much light it gets, if it's in a forest canopy, it's going to take a slow time to get up. If it's open grown, it's going to grow wider, and it's going to grow pretty fast. And it's obviously, it's got to get up to the sunlight, and it has to reproduce. And if you grow a chestnut in an open situation, you get sexual reproduction much earlier than a poor canopy tree, which has to drive its way up to the top. Oh yeah, and then of course, you have to get it. The most danger in this period is sort of deer, who can really keep knocking back the main stem of the tree. But once you get above that, it's pretty hard to kill it once you get past that. And now it's trying to grow and become sexually active. So then here's the tree. Let's say the tree is grown up into the canopy, and even if you have the best tree, this is a problem. One tree is a problem with chestnut because they generally don't self-pollinate. That's a very small percentage. So they need other trees. So if there aren't other chestnuts around, nothing's going to happen, even if you have the best tree. And let's say our little tree finally gets up into the canopy and starts getting lots of sunlight. Then you have the amazing flowering stage, where you have these yellow catkins that come out. And the chestnut has bisexual parts in every leaf and stem. And if you see there's the female parts, those later on will be the chestnut bird, and these are the male parts. And so they're bisexual, but they need other trees to pollinate properly. And that's a picture of the main tree that looks more like a forest type tree. So you have the flowering stage, which is, around here I would just say July 4th. They're always, no matter what, it seems like they're chestnut catkins around July 4th. And then here's the amazing thing that happens. On these little anthers from the pollen, you get these little pollen grains. These pollen grains are, I think, like 13 microns across. We can't really see them. This is the stuff we're actually trying to work with when we pollinate, which always seems to be an amazing thing. So a little pollen grain comes from over here on this tree, and let's say it's an insect with the wind blows it over. There are obviously lots of these, and if it's lucky, it goes over here, and it gets on one of these little stiles, and we're going to have chestnuts in that bird, at least one chestnut of the 3 positions in that bird. So that's the kind of magical thing that we do. Then, of course, in September, over the whole summer, they grow. And there's this amazing protection system, the bird. And if you haven't picked one up before, if you haven't felt the spiky thorns, it's a very effective. They don't want to be eaten before they're ripe. But once they're ripe and they drop out, then it's fair game. They want to be eaten and taken around. And you have nuts all over the ground in a mature tree. And that's pretty much the life cycle that we just saw. So the chestnut tree wants to grow up, get to the canopy, it wants to flower and produce nuts, and it just wants to sit there for 300 to 600 years and make nuts. And that's what it wants to do. And it's very, it can eventually, if you get enough nuts, you can kind of overwhelm the wildlife, and they're not going to get every single one, so that's how they can reproduce. So that's what the chestnut's trying to do. And it also produces nuts really regularly. It's not like some other trees where they have massed years and non-massed years. It's fairly regular, even in fairly bad conditions. So that's just, and even if you have a 2% success rate with nuts that survive, that's going to be plenty of nuts because the trees produce a lot of nuts. And obviously, the food value for critters is pretty amazing. These are just some of the critters, if you figure them out here, that can eat chestnut, and there's been all sorts of reports about almost every animal likes them, including humans. Right? We like them too. And obviously, before Europeans were here, the Native Americans had their own kind of chestnut culture where they used the bark and they ate the nuts and restored the nuts. And it's good food for humans. When you're trying to make food in winter, you've got a storable source of protein, carbohydrates, and fat. That's really useful. They used it for bark, shingles. There's some medicinal qualities to leaves, apparently. And they like to make dugouts. Up here, they like to make dugout canoes out of the large logs. And of course then, as Europeans came in and we had our own culture, more Europeans more into clearing and using the lumber for furniture and that kind of thing, firewood. So obviously these huge stands, these stands of these huge trees, especially in the pictures you always see from the south, that's what was here when Europeans came in, and they started clearing things out. But still, the chestnut was pretty vibrant even in the 1800s. Then, oh yes. And of course, it's used as building materials. We all know it's used for split rail fences. It's got a lot of good qualities. It has a very high strength to weight ratio. It's very light and very strong. It grows fast for our hardwood. It's fairly rot resistant, so it's nice. It's nice to work with apparently. And there's just more types of furniture that were made with chestnut. And even in the South, it was used for tanning extraction. And that was a huge industry, and you can see all the chestnut. There's so much tannin in the bark and in the lumber that it was actually used in making leather and that kind of thing. And even they said for paper making too. All right. And there's the famous picture of roofed by the chestnut. The chestnut telephone pole is still in use on the Cape. Telephone poles were also a big use for chestnut. And then, of course, we kind of lost some of our chestnut. Well, actually, before we lost our chestnut culture, there was a chestnut culture. People would go out in the fall and they would gather nuts, and it would be a fun thing for people in the north. It was kind of a fun thing. For people in the south, sometimes it was a source of extra income before the winter. And of course, chestnuts in the cities being sold has been around for a while. Those were probably not Americans that they were selling. And I know in the south too, in other places, livestock was let out into the forest just to fatten up on chestnuts, so they could get the pigs bigger and then bring them in drove them into the markets in the cities. And the thing about the south is that shoe money. Families would send kids out, and they'd sell chestnuts, and they'd make a little bit of extra money before winter. All right, so that was the idyllic situation that happened up until around 1900. Then everything seems to change around 1904, and that's obviously things were changing before that, but that's when chestnut blight was first discovered. And somehow in some ship in some nursery stock from somewhere in Asia, and came to some port, and maybe multiple ports in the east, and when they were transferring either ornamental trees or other types of trees, somehow the little evil spores came along too. And they are the ones that bring us the chestnut. They create the fungus. So that came, and obviously it probably was introduced earlier than 1904, but it just started to be noticed in the New York Botanical Garden. The big chestnut trees were starting to die off. The scientists tried to figure out what it was, and they eventually found out that it was a fungus. And by 1950, so between about 1900 and 1950, pretty much every mature American chestnut tree in the whole eastern seaboard died. There seemed to be absolutely no resistance at all. Tried all sorts of different things, but nothing seemed to work. And in case you're wondering, this is the Latin name for the fungus. You can grow it up in a petri dish. It goes underneath the bark, and it sort of interrupts the nutrient flow up to the tree, and it completely girdles the tree. It doesn't allow any nutrients to go up to the top of the tree. And you can see it's actually what you see on the top is there's only half the story. There's also like fungus underneath that you can't even see. So that's what we've been dealing with. And in case you can't see the fungus, you've got arrows too. Now, what you might be used to is in our forest we have these survivors. The question is, how can the tree survive if there's no resistance to the blight? And what's the answer to that question? How can the tree still survive if every large tree has died between 1904 and 1950? Why are there still chestnut? We could probably go out and find some. There's still
Rootstock.
roots. Yeah, it keeps resprouting from the root collar, and the fungus does not affect the root system. So fungus does not affect the root system. So you get trees that grow up, and this is in the woods near my house. This one was 20 or 30 feet high, but obviously got to a certain point, got the blight, and died back. But so most of what we see in England is little seedlings / trees that are going to die in a few years. That's mostly what we see. Now, the question is, how come American trees are so susceptible to this? And it all has to do with something that happened many, many thousands of years ago. There are 4 major kinds of chestnuts across the world: European, Chinese, and Japanese. And the American just has been isolated so long that it never had a chance to get any resistance to the Asian blight. And even in Europe, you see they're farther away, they've had some trouble with blight, although the tree has been able to adapt a little better, but at times it's been touch and go even in Europe. So obviously, just because America's been separated for so long from the rest of the world, right, Pangea, it's, that's why we have no resistance. So we've been isolated for a long time. Now, early scientists, when they started to try to figure this out, everyone knew that Chinese and Japanese trees had resistance, but they somehow decided, well, they've made some early hybrids. They decided, why not take Chinese and American and breed them, and then take the children, and they should be somewhat blight resistant. But the problem was, for some reason, they only made a few. They only did one generation or two generations, and then sort of gave up, and they didn't really get the results they expected. So that's really what what the American Chestnut Foundation does. But we just take it to a little higher level. And in 1983, TACF was founded, and I think Charles Brennan, was he a corn geneticist too?
Yeah.
Yeah. He said, well, this plan should work for chestnut. You just have to go down a few more generations. And I'm thinking back to my ninth grade biology, which I didn't do very well in. But if you have two different types of sets of pea plants and you want to get the traits from one to the other, if you breed them and select, you eventually can, almost transfer color or shape from one to the other. And that's really what the backcross breeding is. You're just trying to get the trait from one variety of species to the other. And that's basically what TACF does. It's just sort of natural so far. And then this very important yet seemingly very low resolution picture, which I can never find a good one of, is the method of you take a Chinese and American and you take their offspring, then you select for American traits, then you again take more American home. You keep going back and you back cross with American. So eventually the idea is that by the time you get to the 6th generation down here, you have a tree that's mostly American, but you've just kept the Chinese blight resistance. And as you well know, when you're doing hybridization or you're trying to cross two things, you get a random selection of two traits. So when you buy your Labradoodle, how much Labrador, how much Poodle, you never really know. And then just there, if you want to know what else is trying to kill the chestnut tree, I think Paul's going to talk about this later, is something called ink disease, which unfortunately that attacks the roots, the one place we thought the trees were safe, and they did a lot of trouble with that in the south. And so I said, I'm looking forward to hearing what Paul has to say about that later. At TACF, we're trying to figure out which strains or which trees are more resistant to ink disease. As it turns out, that only happens generally in warmer climates, but I know it's been moving. It's been moving north. There's Joe James. There's a seedling that's totally dead from its top to bottom. And then another thing that's, I know some can be, there's also gallwasser, which basically lays its eggs inside the leaves and messes up the flowering process. So that's another problem that could happen, but we probably lucky to forget that one. So what we try to use, these are the only things that chestnut has going for it. Maybe Chinese blight resistance. There are also sometimes viruses that actually kill the fungus, so you can use in certain situations. That's going to keep trees alive. And obviously now the whole new genetic research, mapping the chestnut genome, and simple testing to see what we actually have is really going to help out. And what we've been doing for a long time is we've been working on these BC3F3 orchards to make these seeds, and that's what we've really been spending a lot of time. And the great thing about the state chapters is that we actually are trying to protect and save the genetic material of Massachusetts and Rhode Island. So we've been working our trees that we found survivors of all those different levels of the breeding. And and of course the whole testing this is going to take generations, longer than I will be around, because when we actually get our final product out into the forest, we have to see how it behaves, because sometimes trees that we grow in open orchards might not be behaving like trees that grow in woods. So it's going to take a long time, and I know the Science Cabinet has suggested that we do more back cross breeding with another few steps, so that's also happening too. And as I said, the nice thing about the state chapters is we're going to try to make a chestnut that is going to work in Massachusetts or Maine, and there's also got to be a chestnut that works down in Alabama, Mississippi, or Georgia. So we have to. There are different regional, obviously. There's a lot of regional specific traits in the chestnut. So every couple hundred miles of the range, you might need to have a special version of the chestnut. So that's another thing that I know we're working on. And we spent a lot of time with this. Our orchards, we plant a bunch of trees, and then we try to kill them with the blight. And we see the ones that survive our inoculation, and those are the ones we keep, and those are the ones that are going into the new seed orchards. This is the new step we're at now, where the nuts from our current orchards go into these blocks and plots. So you put these plots in, and then eventually you have like 150 trees. You get the best one, and then this is next to another best one, another best one. You have these large blocks where they can cross-pollinate and produce trees that hopefully are fairly blight resistant. Yeah, plot and block. And cedar, that's what we really are spending a lot of our time on, trying to set these up, because we have to get 20 or 30-year agreements with different landholders or public entities, and put up deer fencing and do this. And it also just takes a lot of space. It's a lot of space. It's acres and acres of space. So these are all the things that we need, obviously. And all cost money too. The cool thing about these seed orchards is, and I've already started to see some of them, trees that I work on pollinating, I can see the big survivors in these various orchards, and they're all together, and we all get to cross-pollinate. But that's hopefully what we'll use to start reforestation experiments. And we'll get these beautiful seeds. And if the voles don't get them, and if the mice don't eat them, if the wild turkeys don't eat them, and the squirrels don't get them, and the bears don't get them, and the deer don't eat them, and if the moose don't get them, and if the gull wasp don't get them, and then if the phytophthora doesn't get them, then eventually, hopefully they get to grow up. They get to grow up and be a happy little chestnut. So that's our goal, to make this chestnut that, for us, personally, selfishly, we want a chestnut that can grow anywhere in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. And if you want to get involved, you can start attending board meetings. You can get involved with the inoculations or the planting of our new seed orchards. And just spread the word, because a lot of people sort of know the story, but a lot of people who would be interested don't even know the story. And obviously membership helps with that. And there we are. We're preserving at least some of what's left of the chestnut DNA in Rhode Island and Massachusetts. And this is the tree at Quabbin Reservoir, and that's actually in our breeding program now. So we've saved that. That tree, I know, is starting to die. So a lot of these trees we get to the large survivors right before they're about to die, which is good. And that's pretty much it. If you want to, we have some modern social media. We have a website if you're interested. We have Twitter, which we don't use very much. We have a Facebook page, which actually seems to be the new thing that people. And you can always go on to afc.org and get lots of information on chestnut. And I think that is pretty much it. Any questions on just general introduction to chestnut? Just any general question. No question is too silly. No question is. This is the time for any question. But that's just what we're working with.
Does the blight have an enemy?
Sometimes a virus, and then sometimes if it kills off its host, right? If it kills off its host, if it's too effective, but unfortunately the blight can live on other trees and not kill them. Like I know it lives on hickory, it's some other trees, so it's out of oaks so it lives on other trees and doesn't kill them, so it's kind of always out there. And trying to stop spores from spreading is very, very difficult. And we've tried different kinds of fungicides, and some of those things work, but they're temporary and they need a lot of continuing maintenance. If you want to try to keep alive a tree, it just takes a lot of work to do for too many trees. Any other questions about? This is just a very general introduction. You will get a lot more specifics later on from Paul.
Is there a public database so you can know if you found something that is new and hasn't
If you
been seen
think you
before.
found a surviving tree, I
Yes.
think there's a tree, it's a tree ID form, right? Is it on our site?
Yes,
And,
Yeah, so currently, the TACF science staff tracks any of the reported trees that we get, so I'm not a person from England, there's some in the other region. We are working on developing an online database where eventually we can actually have people submit, tree reports online, but that's been a very long, expensive thing to develop, and it's nice to have tools like that are probably going to be a little later to come along. But eventually, that is the hope, because that would be really nice to be able to just streamline everything, using the internet for good purposes.
yeah, and once we've done all the breeding work, it shouldn't be too hard to work in, new mother trees, that kind of thing. 'Cause it takes so much time, every generation of those, it's 5 or 6 or 10 years for us to get one of those, get down another level on 3D chart. But once you have something that's good, you can work in an old tree and it won't take quite as long to get what you need. But, yes.
Question, when you crossbreed the American with a chestnut, with a Oriental chestnut, and you establish the blight freeness, why doesn't that get washed out when you further crossbreed it?
It does, I think it does to a certain extent, that's why I have to keep selecting all the time for blight resistance.
The way blight resistance is inherited is assumed to be incompletely dominant. So when you cross Chinese and American chestnut, you don't actually get full resistance in your offspring, you only get half. So it's like crossing a white flower and a red flower and getting pink back out, and you really want to get to red. So we actually, the back crossing that we do increases the Americanness of the tree, but not the resistance, and it's the intercrossing that we do in our seed orchards and in our breeding orchards that boost the resistance, which is basically, at that stage, you're crossing pink and pink, and you might get red back out, if that makes sense. Not many, but some of them will have, should, in theory, have all the genes for resistance.
So you promote that blight, that's through the very.
Right, every stage of the game, we challenge the trees with chestnut blight and then select the ones that have the best inherent resistance. That's why it takes about 6 generations at least.
How far have we got now as far as 100%?
It varies. Our research farm has gotten at least through all 6 generations of breeding with many of their lines. We're still testing, so some of them look great, some of them are just okay. But there's a few really good lines out there that have. I don't think we're ever going to have full resistance. Chinese chestnut doesn't have full resistance. It has very high resistance. But you give chestnut blight to a really small Chinese chestnut or a really stressed out Chinese chestnut, it's going to show symptoms and potentially die. But we want the American chestnut to have enough tools to at least be able to survive unassisted and do its chestnut thing.
At least throw enough fruit out this whole research.
Exactly, yeah.
Is there any way you're enabling the blight to continue more so than if you didn't use that as a way to inoculate?
I don't think so. There's a lot of natural strains of blight out there. We only use 2 specifically, and they're just in very specific locations where our orchards are. I mean, I'm sure there's some impact, but I think on the landscape scale, it's probably pretty small.
Because there's blight through all of Rhode Island, and it's airborne, and people imported it.
We haven't done any inoculating yet in Rhode Island, so we haven't brought anything yet.
Yeah, so, and it's spread, it's within 50 years, it's spread on its own through every tree on the East Coast, just airborne, and on birds, everything.
That's just random, you can't stop.
Yeah,
Yeah, we have to race sometimes to inoculate our orchards before the natural blight and just the neighborhood starts killing them.
Yeah. But we do it in a controlled way, that's why we do it the same way in each tree, to make the same wounds in each tree to see how well, in a controlled way, to see comparison.
Another question over here?
To avoid inbreeding in this process, it would be nice to have a large number of different lines.
Right.
How many lines exist now?
Let's see, what are we doing? In the state, we do 20?
It's 20 per resistant source within the chapter breeding programs. I think Meadowview is 30, but that should be enough to avoid inbreeding infection. And then this chapter has actually done 20 of 2 different sources of resistance. We have 40 distinct lines.
And we're starting to
And-
report them.
And about 10 of managing.
Right.
So that's about 50.
Yeah,
Going back to like 1492.
yeah.
If other, the full family of chestnuts, Chinese, European, were all introduced at that time, would this problem have resolved itself by now? Or, because what you're saying is that the American chestnut is the one and only. Does that, would that sound feasible?
I think over time it might heal itself, but we're not that patient. I mean, just,
Well, generation time for a tree is pretty long. So
Yeah.
you need a lot of generations of sexual crossing to see those kinds of adaptations come out.
And they're not flowering, so they can't grow.
yeah. Yeah, the problem is they generally die right before they start flowering, so it's very hard for the tree to
And you need two trees.
and you need two trees to sort out itself. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just a comment on this is that the U.S. Forest Service actually made the problem worse because when they said all the chestnuts are going to die, they basically told people to cut down all the chestnut
Right,
trees.
yeah, we're also.
So they don't really know how well they would have, some of them may have fought the blight.
I know there was like extra super lumbering on them when they found out they were all, people thought that it would hurt the timber value, so probably there's more cutting than that.
I have one more question.
All right, let's play the last one and we'll move on. Yes.
If the wild trees in the woods that haven't been doctored with, all the
Right.
crossbreeding, it seems to me they get up to be about 5, 8 years old, then they get hit by the blight.
Exactly.
Why wouldn't they get hit either the day they pop out of the ground or 100 years ago? Why is it like nothing under one thing?
I don't know why it seems like
It's kind of a crapshoot, honestly, as to when they get it. I mean, in northern New England, we tend to find trees that hang on longer just because there's less blight floating around. But when you get to that 5 to 8 year point in their development, that's when they start, maybe having some natural cracks in the bark, or maybe some cracks around the branch crotches when the bark is starting to develop a little bit more, and the blight's opportunistic. So any opening into the tissue under the bark is what it's looking for, and that's probably the stage where it's most likely that starts to happen. When they're young, they have a very tight, smooth bark. There's not a lot of ways for blight to get in there.
So,
And there's not much surface area
so
either.
if you were to take a little thing, 1 inch tall or so, and cut the stem of the bark, you could infect it at that point.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they can be infected.
They get infected. There's no magic age stage where they're susceptible or
The
not.
young ones are the ones that first get it, of course, but in some of these big trees here and there, survive through it, so they must have some kind of.
Well, they're usually just lucky. Usually the bigger trees survive, may be surviving for a while, but when and if blight, attaches itself, there's usually not a whole lot that they can do about it.
Although some blight is stronger and works faster than others, and then the tree also, does the tree have roots in a good moist environment where it can get nutrients and water easily to grow around a canker, especially if it's a canker that's the slow growing kind of blight.
Yeah, or if there's hypervirus out there.
Yeah.
That's not super common in the US, but.
Thanks.
Yeah.
It's chestnuts.
I heard some people, I guess the resistance perhaps comes from the soil, and some people have tried to wrap the stem.
Yeah, the fungus can't survive in soil, so what they do is basically try to bring the soil up to the tree so you can make a mud pack and keep. That was one of those sort of high maintenance things. You really want to save a tree, you can work on it pretty hard and save it. Although I've had trees in my own yard that I've tried to save, but still I can't save even those kind of things. Yeah, so you're basically making the soil come up and be part of the tree. So you have to use kind of like a mortar mix of soil, and you have to put saran wrap around and keep it. It's hard to keep it going. That's the problem.
Once you get the seed out, down the line, into the woods, what provisions will you have to make in order to keep all the critters at bay?
That's the big question. Right? We love to be at that stage, and we're trying. I mean, a lot of us in the chapter do experiments with how do you protect them? Do you just throw out so many that they can't get them all, or you just plan on getting some of them and forgetting some of them? And that's a huge, I mean, I don't think this kind of restoration project has been tried with any other huge tree. So we're kind of on uncharted ground. And it's not that easy to grow hardwoods anyway, and, I know there's trouble with planting oaks and that kind of thing.
Yeah,
So,
everything.
yeah, so it's not an easy task, even under ideal conditions. So that's, obviously something I'll have to figure out. Is it better to do, to bury seedlings, or better to plant nuts, or is it better to plant slightly more mature trees and plant fewer of them? But that's the whole reforestation thing, which I know the chapter is planning to start working on.
Yeah, we have some projects
Yeah.
going with that.
And then the national list of reforestation plan.
A couple of years ago, we had a good talk on that with Dr. Leela Pinchot, and that is online. Brian Clark made a YouTube, and you can find that online.
Well, you have to bear in mind too that the critters actually help. Squirrels bury some nuts, and they don't find them all later on.
So they pass it away.
And so they carry them out away from the trees, bury some that are going to come up. Then you have other critters that, like deer, that can be a real problem. That was the case around Clawson with reforestation. They actually opened it up for deer hunting, because of grass.
All right, we're just going to have a quick transition here, and I think we're going to go into our national roundup. We need to
No, that's okay. So I'm gonna get some